Have you ever thought, what do I do if I don't like my own body? We'll talk about it today on the Faithful and True podcast. Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We are happy to be back with you again today. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host, and as usual, we are joined by Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, how are you today?
I'm doing well.
We dug deep into our bag of tricks here at Faithful and True today, and we came up with a real winner. We have with us today Jim Farm, the clinical director, and I would say probably one of the most popular counselors on the staff.
Listen, I've been in enough of these that he says that about everyone.
Well, you know.
All of his children are his favorites. That's what's true.
No, I have one. No, no. Yeah, that's right. I love them all. Jim, welcome. We're happy to have you with us today.
Happy to be back in the studio with you guys.
Jim's been with us before. If you're a follower of these podcasts, although this might be the first one that's on our new YouTube channel.
It is. The last two, I was kind of fighting COVID. And
that's
so
right.
Glad to be back in person with everybody.
Well, we now have the Faithful and True channel on YouTube that we're very excited about. We invite you to visit there if you haven't already, and subscribe if you will. Click the like button. Leave comments if you'd like. We appreciate hearing from you. Today, we have brought Jim in to address a couple of topics that seem to come up in your sessions with the men that you counsel.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Greg and I thought we might talk about body shame today and our perception, our relationship with our physical self, our body.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we're just going to say at the beginning is this conversation specifically is going to be about men and body shame. We know that body shame and the relationship with the body is a significant issue for women also. But what's also true is for a lot of men, it's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about because we are taught to believe that we're supposed to be comfortable with who we are physically. We're not supposed to be arrogant, and we're not supposed to be insecure. And yet in working with the men, specifically who struggle with sexual addiction, there can be a lot of mixed messages about who they are physically. And just to begin with, one of the things that came out in this research that we did recently is just early exposure to pornography is going to create a certain level of body shame. And it comes from what I refer to as comparison-based identity, where we begin to believe that our value, our identity, our safety comes from how we compare to somebody else. And one of the principles that we teach at the workshop is that when we were little boys, we liked who we were. We liked the way that God created us. We were satisfied with that. But what happens is we have to be taught our insecurities. And so we hear criticism, we hear judgment, we're rejected. And then we begin to have those seeds of insecurities. And that especially can be true about how we perceive who we are physically.
Yeah. And I would say, one of the things that I've talked with guys about as well in group is the lack of blessing around our physical body. Mm-hmm. Has anyone ever spoken truths about our physical self? I think that's a hard thing for fathers to do, specifically
Absolutely.
For their sons. And so on top of that, if we get negative messages in the locker room or where have you outside, it really creates a lot of insecurity and inadequacy for us.
Well, one of the things I always encourage men to consider, and it's one of the things that we talk about at the workshop, is were you ever teased for who you are physically? Were you ever too tall, too short, too skinny, too fat, whatever? Did you go through a season of acne where you felt self-conscious about that? And what can be true is I don't even have to be teased about it, but if I become self-conscious of it, that's what can create chaos. And the way I distinguish between self-awareness and self-consciousness is the survivor strategy trying to figure out what other people believe and perceive, whereas self-awareness is when I'm trying to understand what God believes and perceives. So one is based upon how others see me, and then the wise man, it's how does God see me? But what we know is in our culture where we're judged, we're excluded based upon who we are physically, it can create a lot of insecurities and anxiety for men.
Yeah. One of the things I thought we would talk about, and specifically about this, is how does this come about? So I always share, I think a lot of us, if we grew up in sports or even just in school and went to gym class, right? I always kind of describe it as these open showers. I always call them cattle stalls. You know what I mean? Because they're these big poles, and you're elbow to elbow the next guy. And if you didn't get any conversation about sexuality, and it typically happens around that time when you're going through puberty, and you're looking at the next guy, and you're either ahead of them or you're behind them, and you walk out of there thinking there must be something wrong with me.
I'm less than.
The origin message of shame is there's something wrong with me. And even before that, one of the things I was aware of, I have 2 sons, and we lived in a neighborhood when they were growing up that was very boy oriented, and there were tons of games and sports, and we've talked to our boys about this, but one of the things I see is that for little boys, sports is the currency of relationships and how well you play. And the better player you are, the more currency you have, the more money, the more power, those kinds of concepts. And so even as a little boy, you're out playing catch or kickball or whatever the game may be, you're comparing yourself to the other boys. A lot of times the younger brother is comparing himself to the older brother. I've heard so many stories of the impact it had. I had 2 older brothers. We would go out and play basketball. And of course they were going to be better than me because they were older, but I didn't have a concept of that. I didn't realize it was comparison of apples to oranges. I was believing we were the same, but in reality we weren't, and nobody was telling me the difference. So I end up thinking I'm not enough because I'm not as good as my brothers, but there's no way I could have been because I'm several years younger than they are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the other issue is well, what if there are imperfections? What if I am overweight? What if I am not athletic? Then what does that mean about me?
Right. And I think this is significant in the field that we are in, because what I believe about who I am physically directly plays out in how I express myself sexually. So whatever insecurities or fears I have about my body, it in some way is going to play out in my sexual experiences. For some men, the level of insecurities that they have actually drives them into the pornography and the masturbation, because that feels safe. Because if there's no one with me, then I can't be judged. I can't be rejected. And so healing how I view my body is actually foundational into recovery and healing and moving forward relationally and sexually in the appropriate context.
Yeah.
It just struck me that between the 3 of us in the panel here, we have 7 sons.
Yes.
Jim has 3,
right.
No daughters. We have 2, no daughters. You have 2 sons, no daughters. We know a lot about boys.
Right.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I know you mentioned this earlier on, but it strikes me that most men get exposed to pornography right during this stage. This middle school stage in which they're just starting to become aware of their bodies, but other guys' bodies as well.
Right. Well, it's kind of in that age of 8 to 12 is typically when we see the men are first exposed. And what happens is I'm a little boy, I'm looking at pornography, and I'm comparing myself to this adult man that is in the pornography. And again, as a little boy, I'm thinking it's apples to apples. But the reality is it's apples to oranges. But if I don't have a wise man or female voice in my life saying, actually, you're not the same, you haven't gone through this change, kind of like the locker room experience. If you didn't have a wise dad or a wise coach saying, hey, you just haven't gone through puberty yet, it's going to happen to you, and almost like you said at first, a blessing about who we are at the moment, then we internalize and make all these meanings out of it that lead to our own insecurities. One of the things that we've talked about before are what are some of the reactions when people do have insecurities? And I would say that everyone has insecurities. And insecurities are not about how we look. Because there are a lot of people out there that we would perceive as they meet the physical prototype. They meet the standard, whatever that is, but they still have insecurities. So it's not about how I look. It's about what I believe about how I look. So I know that one of the ways that men try to navigate this is this obsessive, constant working out. That is almost a self-abuse where they're constantly going to the gym, they're constantly working out, so afraid that whatever physical attribute that they may have that they believe is positive that they're going to lose, but they're also hyperly focused on whatever it is in their bodies that they're insecure about that they're trying to improve.
Yeah, because if there's anything imperfect about me, that must, you may not accept me, right? You may not appreciate me.
Right. I think another way that can happen, though, is if I am insecure, then I'm constantly looking for reassurance from somebody else that I'm desirable, that I'm choosable. And I think for a lot of men, that's what the fantasy or even their acting out behavior has been driven by, and it can work two ways. For some men, they have this insecurity because they don't believe they've ever met the standard. So if the right person or enough people tell them that they're attractive or desirable, then that will heal them. But I also work with men that for them, when they were in high school and college, they kind of won the genetic lottery. Their bodies were the standard. They did get affirmed for that. Mm-hmm. But as we age and we begin to lose some of that, our fear is that we don't have it anymore. So I use my sexual acting out as an attempt to get some sort of affirmation that I've still got it. But again, whatever I perceive about myself, to understand what energy is that bringing into the sexual acting out.
Yeah. Well, to take it to another level, one of the questions, Greg, that I received quite a few times from guys is, I engage in this self-injurious behavior within my acting out. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of shame about that. The acting out brings a lot of shame, but if the self-injury is a part of that, especially for men, because that kind of behavior often is associated with teenage girls. Mm-hmm. And so, they often feel like, well, I can't share that with a bunch of other guys.
Right.
But when they muster up enough courage to do that, but it's an important question is,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
What leads me to the self-harm behavior?
Well, and so what we want to just validate is it's more common than we are aware of because it's not something that we regularly talk about. So the fact that both you and I have worked with men that part of their acting out was to do self-injury, that they would cut themselves, that they would physically do things that hurt during their sexual acting out experience. And I think that the thing to understand is part of that can be driven by shame, that I have so much shame about who I am physically that I believe I deserve this injury. It's almost as if I must hurt myself because it is a reflection of the shame that I'm feeling. And another thing that it can be about is this distorted understanding of punishment. If you grew up in an environment where physical punishment was present, if there was spanking, or maybe at the extreme of there was beatings, then you've been taught to punish your body when you've done something wrong. And so this can be some distorted manifestation of a desire to discipline myself because of the shame I feel about my sexual acting out.
Yeah. I think another component that plays into this for some men is if they did experience sexual abuse, mm-hmm. When they were younger. Because the reality is our bodies, I believe we're created by God to respond in arousal. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes, if I was forced to do something or my body responded in a way that it was actually created to respond, but I didn't really want that to happen. Mm-hmm. There's this internalized anger that happens if I'm not able to talk about that. And sometimes I'll redirect that back at myself.
Absolutely. Well, and you kind of identified this idea of the neurochemical associations. And we talk a lot about that at the workshops and in working with the clients that, Mark used to say, neurons that fire together wire together. Mm-hmm. So in those early associations, if there was physical or sexual abuse and there was arousal associated with that, then it makes sense then that I have this chaos that brings, but I still have the old associations, the old connections. And so if I don't understand why I'm doing it, and I especially have shame about it, it sends me into this secrecy that keeps it powerful. And one of the ways that we are able to unwire and then rewire our brain is by bringing it out into the light and having those conversations with someone that won't judge us or shame us, to be able to say, and this is a phrase I use often, you know what, based upon your story, it makes perfect sense that that would be powerful for you, or it makes sense that you would be drawn towards that because of those early associations.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's exactly right, is their courage to be able to start to share about that, even though there is a lot of insecurities. Because what that does then is it opens them up to recovering, reclaiming that healthy component of their sexuality that, God created their bodies to react that way, to respond that way, and also to give and receive, pleasure in a healthy way, not out of this obligatory or shame-based place.
Right. You mentioned this, and so I want to go back to it, this idea of one of the phrases that you hear a lot in our field is sexualized rage. Yeah. And I do think it's important that sometimes that sexualized rage is directed towards others, and we can see that manifest itself as violence towards partners. But very much like you said, sometimes that sexualized rage is internalized and directed towards ourselves. And so it can be in circumstances where I am choosing to bring physical harm because of the anger that I feel at myself. And maybe the language in my head is, I'm angry because I can't stop. And so I do this in an attempt to either try to create more desire to stop, or just my rage doesn't have any other place to go, so it comes back towards me.
Yeah. And so in those situations, a big part of the recovery is, can I get in touch with the origination of that anger where I initially suppressed it because of lack of safety, and be able to start to speak out the anger or the sorrow that initially was there.
One thing that is also many times not mentioned in the context of men, but it is this idea of trying to regulate my eating in order to regulate my physical appearance. And so more and more we're seeing with the men who come through the workshop and the men that we work with is there's some sort of manifestation of an eating disorder. And we're working with more men who struggle with bulimia or anorexia. And bulimia is the binge eating where then I purge. Anorexia is an intentional effort to starve. And it's because if there's a standard given to me about the way I'm supposed to look, and again, I want that standard for a reason. I often say, if you're a perfectionist, you're not a perfectionist for the sake of being perfect. You are trying to be perfect because of what you believe you get. So if I'm perfect, I get to be loved. If I'm perfect, I get to be safe. If I'm perfect, I get to be chosen. Well, if we expand that to, if I have the perfect body, well, I don't want a perfect body just for the sake of having a perfect body. I want a perfect body because if I have a perfect body, I will be loved. I will be chosen. I will be included. And so it makes sense that for men who have shame about their bodies, or were given negative messages about their bodies, or have insecurities about their bodies, they're trying to regulate their appearance based upon how they eat. And so we are seeing more men. And just like the self-harm creates so much shame, that anytime a man is struggling with what would be considered an eating disorder, it can create significant shame for them also. In fact, I heard Mark talk about, and I think it's absolutely true, the things that we have the most shame about are the things that we talk about last. Yeah. It's kind of a progressive order. That's right. And so it makes sense that a man is able to talk about his sexual addiction and his acting out behaviors that are what he would say more traditional. And then eventually, when he feels safe enough, he can begin talking about some of these other things where he's had so much shame about them that he never imagined that he could talk about them. But eventually he's able to, and our hope is that in that moment, he begins to feel freedom.
Yeah. Isn't that tied a little bit to the men that come to us for help? And because we've heard Mark say this 1,000 times, if you knew everything there was to know about me, you wouldn't like me and you wouldn't accept me. And then the longer that the more you get to know them, the more they start to reveal those things that they hide the deepest.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Well, and one of the things that we talk about at the workshop is, for all of us, it's like there is a portion that we are uncomfortable, struggling about. We can't even imagine talking about. Yeah. And the counseling center that I went to would often say the stuff that you don't talk about the most is the stuff that defines you the most. And you've heard me talk about that last 10%.
Yeah.
If we go to an experience and we share 90%, that is great. And that last 10% that we're not talking about is really what's driving the train. And so we got to find safe enough men, safe enough places to talk about that. And we also talk about at the men's workshop, our shame is in the details. And so until we find a safe place where we can talk about some of the details of our acting out, for instance, the self-harm, or we can talk about some of the shame around our body image and how we use eating to try to regulate that. Once we find that safe place, then it takes that courage to step into that and start talking about it.
Yeah, and it provides the pathway for healing when we start to remove those protective barriers that we've put in place to buffer us from being hurt again. But if you think about it, from a child standpoint, when we grow up in a place of chaos, what do kids control? Their physical self, right? I mean, they control what they, eating, and it's one area that they do have a certain level of control over. And so our physical body, being able to go back to that and have a healthy relationship with that, or may not have started off all that well.
Right. And one of the things that I'm aware of that I talk to men about is, so there was a time, it's not like attractiveness and beauty or being handsome is brand new. That's been around for a long time. But if you go back in time to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, what was true is there was a wider range of what attractiveness was. You had a wide range of women that would be seen as attractive, and the same thing with men. I think what has happened, and I attribute it some to the internet, where this standard attractive scale has been created, where in order to be a beautiful woman, you must meet this standard. There's not a range anymore. And I think we're seeing the same thing with men. In order to be attractive, you have to be this tall. You have to be athletic. You have to have this six-pack. You have to have muscles that are well-defined. Whatever the standard is, and we can all cognitively know it's an unrealistic standard, but we still hear that invitation to try to meet it, and the insecurities that we feel because we don't can really be intensified, especially if we're struggling with sexual addiction.
Yeah. So do you, in terms of recovering this part of ourself, Greg, is it kind of like how we deal with the emotional part of ourself, the things that we're most shameful about and most vulnerable about? Is it a matter of being able to, express those, bring those into the open, not hide those aspects of ourselves?
Yeah, and one of the things that I would hope is for men who are in recovery, they have a safe place where they can talk about who they are physically and what they believe about that. Years ago when I did my doctoral work, the focus of my work was an area called embodiment theology. And embodiment theology is the desire to bring the truth of God's desires for the physical creation kind of back into our theology. And the challenge is, years ago, and it started really with the Greek, so it's been significant, was there was a separation between the physical world and the spiritual world. And what began to happen is we began to believe that anything physical was bad or sinful, and anything spiritual was good. And there was this unconscious and sometimes conscious shift to begin to believe, well, the goal of my faith is to become more spiritual and less physical. And embodiment theology basically says, actually, it is in creation first that we knew God. And so it's not about moving away from creation, it's about moving towards creation and embracing creation as a way of knowing God, that creation itself, including our physical self, is a revelation of the truth of God. And it's about stewardship. And I say this, stewardship begins with ownership. I cannot steward something I don't own. And one of the scriptures I go back to and I teach on is when the Bible says you were knitted together in your mother's womb. We hear that all the time, but one of the things I was introduced to is that word knitted in the Hebrew is a word of intentional craftsmanship, that there was a design. I often tell men that the designer of the universe has designed you physically, and there's a goodness, there's a beauty to that. And the standard that we use changes, kind of like what I referred to. If you look back 50 years ago, there was a different standard of attractiveness. You look back 200 years ago, completely different standard. So when a guy says he just wants to be good looking, or a lot of times I'll ask, what are you drawn to? And they say, well, attractive people. Well, I want them to understand, well, that's actually a very fluid term that has been created by our culture. It's not this stagnant term that God created, but it's this understanding based upon culture and circumstances. I use the example that if you lived 200 years ago, what was seen as attractive was if you were very pale-skinned and you were overweight. Because if you were pale-skinned and overweight, that meant that you had money, that you were a landowner. If you were thin and skinny, it meant that you worked out in the fields. Mm-hmm. And so the same principle is there. The culture is defining attractiveness. And so part of the work that we have to do is transcend a cultural definition of beauty and move to the divine definition of beauty. And that's what comes from God.
Yeah. And part of that beauty may actually be part of our physical imperfections.
Mm-hmm. Our uniqueness is what is beautiful. It's what is different about us that can be celebrated. And yet we don't live in a culture. And in some ways, the church can buy into that too, where we're not given that blessing. We're back to that thing that so many of us missed, but that blessing about who we are physically, that this is God's good creation. And so as we conclude, the thing I would say is this is definitely a part of the conversation of recovery. So if you're in a small group, if you're with a therapist, that there needs to be, it's just so helpful to have those conversations about what do I believe about who I am physically? Where is my shame? Where is my insecurities? And get some help. And in those ways that I may be self-harming, whether it's over-exercise or in my eating habits, or in the case of some of our clients, physical self-harm, that they find a safe place to be able to talk about that. Because truly, it is beyond just the scripture. It is the reality that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that there is a beauty to our created selves, and recovery is reclaiming that.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, and I think once we get to that place where we start to see that value of ourselves physically, we start to take care of our physical bodies from that perspective.
Right. Yeah. It is, again, that stewardship piece. Yeah. When I own it and celebrate it, then I'm going to seek to be a good steward of it. If I reject it and abandon it, I'm not going to take good care of it. And so part of recovery is reclaiming a desire to be a good steward of who I am physically.
Yeah. And I would say, as Randy and I sit here with shiny bald heads with your full head of hair, we find value in that.
Yeah. Don't get me started. Jim, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. We've been looking forward to this. And, this kind of brings about an idea that Greg and I have been talking about, and that's extending an invitation to our viewers to, this idea came from men that you guys both counsel, bringing questions and issues to you guys to looking for answers. And we know that there's thousands of guys out there that are thinking the same thing. If you have a subject matter or a question that you'd like to ask, we invite you to send that question to us at info@faithfulandtrue.com. And we're going to be accumulating those questions and have some special frequently asked questions, a podcast dedicated to answering those questions. So we would look forward to receiving those from you. Again, we extend the invitation to visit our YouTube channel, the Faithful and True channel, and to join our podcast. What's the word I'm looking for, Greg? I'm blanking on. Subscribe. Thank you very much. Subscribe to our listening audience. I had to ask our producer what the question was. I got on a roll.
You're still reeling from the topic today.
I am. Well, the more you talked about having the perfect body and this great image of yourself, I couldn't get off of that. So anyway, subscribe to our YouTube channel if you would, please, and like us. We'd like that very much. Until we can join you again next week, we invite you to have a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.